What's up, Instagram? So we're going to bust this myth today that black people are stupid with low IQs. But firstly, I made an IQ video a while back, and I think we'll briefly run through some of the reasons why IQ isn't a good measurement of intelligence before we get into the racial issue. So here's a quick recap. I'll speed it up so we can get through it quick.
It's a heavy debate to whether a rise in IQ corresponds to a rise in general intelligence or just necessarily the skills relating to taking an IQ test. Turkheim has stated that adoption from a poor home to a well-off home is associated with a 12 to 18 point gain in IQ over their biological parents. So you can see that how environmental factors definitely can increase someone's IQ. Motivation is also a factor that can increase IQ test results. A meta-study from the Pennsylvania School of Arts and Science found that offering the test subject just $10 increased previously low-scoring people an average of 16 points. Intelligence is multifaceted. You can be smart in one area and less smart in another. Singapore has one of the highest average IQs, but one of the lowest average emotional intelligence scores. Also, high IQs and low IQs don't necessarily correspond with the advancement of a nation. Ireland, by European standards, has a low IQ, somewhere between 91 and 96. However, Ireland is ranked third in the entire world for Human Development Index, fourth in the world for GDP per capita. Montenegro is a European nation with an average IQ of 86, but has a very high Human Development Index.
I make a slight error in this next clip because Cambodia's IQ is 84 and not 91, but let's use Thailand and Vietnam because they have a higher IQ than Montenegro, but lower Human Development Indexes and lower GDP per capita, and that's the point that I'm getting at.
Cambodia has an average IQ of 91, but ranked 146th place in the world for Human Development Index. So they have a higher IQ than Montenegro, but score way, way lower. The GDP per capita of Cambodia is $1,400 a year, compared to close to 8,000 for Montenegro. So how can this be, like higher IQ people, smarter, better economy? No, what? This doesn't make sense. In summary, IQ is a poor measurement and far from a conclusive test of intelligence. Albert Einstein is quoted as saying, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will spend its entire life thinking it's stupid. This is why I haven't done an IQ test, and I don't think I would, because I don't like the idea of putting a number on my intelligence. I think this is like a detrimental thing to do for children. And having a high IQ, Asperger's people, for instance, have an above average IQ, but often lead very solitary, socially isolated lives, and sometimes can't even hold down a job. So there's too much emphasis put on IQ, especially in this whole race and IQ debate. There's smart people, there's dumb people of every race, and you can be smart in one area and stupid in another,
So the first debunking factor when it comes to IQ being stagnant and determinate by race is the Flynn Effect. The Flynn Effect has been pioneered by James Flynn, an Irish-American psychologist who I actually have an interview with next week. So if you have any questions about race and IQ, send me them and I'll ask him anything. Anyway, the Flynn Effect shows that IQ is not stagnant and not determinate by race. It can actually increase with access to better education, access to better nutrition, and just an overall better quality of life. The University of Amsterdam did a meta-analysis to determine the actual IQ level of the average sub-Saharan African. This is necessary because a lot of pseudoscientists have been going down to Africa using flawed methods in order to manipulate the outcome, such as purposely avoiding educated African populations, not explaining the tests, going to rural areas where people are often illiterate and have never even written before, ever seen the geometric shapes on a typical IQ test. So what is a meta-analysis? A meta-analysis is the examination of data from a number of independent studies of the same subject in order to determine overall trends. So what did this particular meta-analysis conclude? Well, after examining over 100 published studies, it concluded that the average African IQ is currently comparable to the average level in the Netherlands around the 1950s. Around the 1950s is when the IQ level of the Netherlands started to rise due to better nutrition, better access to education, etc. And as the level of education, nutrition, and overall quality of life in sub-Saharan Africa improves, so will their IQ. And this is what you call the Flynn Effect. Here is a 2010 study which is examining the average IQ of sub-Saharan Africans using the Ravens test, which is an IQ test with an extremely high G loading. Have you seen those memes that have been floating around for, centuries that the average sub-Saharan African IQ is, under 70, which would mean that they're retarded? I'm sure you have, because I saw it the other day on TikTok. And this Italian guy, he got 30,000 likes. He's like, and the lowest IQ'd country is like 65. Some picture of some fucking black villager. But this study is going to dismantle this perception. So the next time you see this racist myth, call them out. So Lynn was the one who originally founded this statement, and he's 90 years old, so you can make that as you will. I mean, he was basically alive during fucking slavery. But anyway, this study has found that the claim that an average African IQ is 67 is untenable. Untenable. Our review indicates that is about 78 for UK norms or 80 for US norms. Keep in mind that the Flynn effect hasn't really taken hold in sub-Saharan Africa yet, so this will rise to over 100 within a few decades if the progression continues. The paper continues. An average IQ around 80 among Africans may appear to be low, but from a historical perspective, this average is not low at all. A representative sample of British adults who took their SPM in 1948 would have had an average IQ of 81. So it is around the average of the UK norms in the 1950s and the Netherlands norms in the 1950s before the Flynn effect really took place. So this is going to increase, I guarantee it. One rebuttal you'll often encounter when discussing the Flynn effect and how IQs aren't stagnant and they often raise over time due to a number of different factors is that people will say these are empty gains. They will say that you cannot increase G because G is inherited, so you can't increase it due to familiarizing yourself with the test or through study and resitting. However, this is false. The IQ of the Ravens test has been increasing 7 points per decade, and the Ravens test is one of the most G-loaded tests. Because of its high G loading, they say that the Ravens test is largely devoid of cultural influences or cultural bias, but this isn't true either. Imagine going to an African village where the kid has never seen any geometric shapes, he's never even seen paper and pen or printed materials before. You're sitting him out under a tree, not in a proper classroom setting, and you expect him to perform the same conditions as in a Western country. Like, this just isn't feasible. Anyway, these previous studies that I cited were focusing largely on the Ravens test, and they found that the average IQ of Africans is above 80, and under old British norms would be closer to 100 or even over 100. This study here shows that all racial groups can increase their IQ on even the most G-loaded tests, such as the Ravens test. Similarly raised test scores in both Africans and non-Africans who were administered the Ravens on 2 separate occasions. After intervention training, both the African and non-African experimental groups improved over baseline compared to the controlled groups, with a significantly greater improvement in the African experimental group. So not only did the African group improve their IQ on a G-loaded test such as the Ravens, they improved it better than the non-African group.
Intellectuals in Race, you cite an observation by the intelligence expert, IQ scientist James Flynn, that just stopped me cold. After the Second World War, you've got large numbers of American troops remaining in Germany. For that matter, there's still several tens of thousands there today. And both black and white American soldiers had children with German women. And Flynn discovered that those children growing up in Germany showed no IQ differences at all. The black kids and the white kids, the same. Quote, quoting Intellectuals in Race, Professor Flynn concluded that the reason was that the offspring of black soldiers in Germany, and now you're quoting Professor Flynn, grew up in a nation with no black subculture, close quote. Which means what? Which means they experienced exactly the same expectations? Is this the...
No. The expectations are external. The culture in which they grew up was not the culture in which black kids grew up in America today.
So they had...
There's no gangster rap that was pervasively available in Germany.
So here's what I'm getting. There is something about black subculture in America today that holds African Americans themselves back?
Yes. In fact, I went into this in a previous book on which about black rednecks and white liberals, because that same subculture.
Let's talk about 2 of your books here. Go ahead.
Because that very same subculture held whites in the South back as well. That in the time this mental testing in the First World War turned up, among other things, the fact that whites from various 4 or 5 southern states scored lower on the mental test than blacks from 4 or 5 northern states. And so it really was a question of the subculture that was there, which was a handicap to both.